I thought I just bought a cheap cabin, but now an Apache woman in the basement says she's my wife? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late autumn settled unevenly across the Wyoming foothills, leaving patches of frozen grass beside stretches of bare earth. The air carried a thin bite, and a pale dusk spread over the narrow trail as Richard Boone guided his tired bay, gelding toward the old cabin he had purchased 2 days earlier. He rode with a steady posture, shoulders squared beneath a coat that had survived too many winters. Richard was 38, a former ranch hand who had drifted through Wyoming after leaving a job that ended in violence he did not talk about. He wanted distance from crowded towns, arguments, and the kind of work that forced him to stand beside men he didn't trust. The cabin offered isolation, and that was enough. He stepped down from the saddle and stretched his back, listening to the stillness around him. The nearest settlement lay nearly a full day's ride away, and no smoke rose from neighboring land. He preferred that. Quiet meant fewer questions and fewer chances for his past to catch him again. His goal was simple: rebuild the property through winter, raise a few horses in spring, and keep to himself. Richard led his horse toward the hitch post. The porch sagged under its own weight. One corner beam leaned outward, and the steps were worn to the shape of whoever had lived here before. He didn't know the man's name. He hadn't asked. All he had been told was that the previous owner abandoned the property without settling his debts, and the cabin went up for sale in a hurry. Richard paid less than he expected, which made him cautious but not enough to walk away. Cheap land rarely came without problems. He opened the door and stepped into the dim interior. The hinges felt stiff from disuse, and the smell of dust and drywood hung in the air. A single warped table stood against the wall. A broken chair lay overturned. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. Richard lit his lantern and hung it from a nail beside the window frame, letting the warm glow settle over the uneven floorboards. He surveyed the room with the eye of someone used to making repairs. The roof joints needed reinforcement. The floor had weak spots. A cold draft slipped under the walls. Nothing he couldn't handle. He was used to working alone, used to building things from nothing. He walked from one end of the room to the other, noting what supplies he would need and how many days the repairs might take. He mentally divided the tasks, reminding himself that winter would come fast, and he needed the cabin secure before the first heavy snowfall. As he unpacked his gear, a faint noise drifted up from beneath the floor, a controlled, repetitive sound that didn't match the wind or settling wood. Richard stopped instantly. His instincts sharpened. Years on ranches, herding cattle through unfriendly territory, had trained him to pay attention to anything out of place. He waited for the noise to repeat, barely breathing. It came again, a small shift of weight, a shallow intake of air. His chest tightened. He wasn't startled so much as immediately alert, calculating possibilities. An animal trapped? Someone hiding? Something abandoned by the old owner? He moved toward the cellar door in the far corner. The latch was rusted shut. He pressed his thumb against it, feeling its resistance before forcing it up. The metal scraped in a harsh line. He lifted the door slowly, controlling the movement so it wouldn't slam. Cold air drifted up, sharper than the room above. He raised the lantern and descended halfway before stopping to look. A woman huddled in the far corner. Her posture told a full story before she spoke. Arms raised to block blows that might never come. Knees pulled tight, shoulders drawn inward. Her long black hair fell around her face in tangled strands, and the thin cloth wrapped around her body looked inadequate against the cold. Raw burns marked both wrists. Her bare feet pressed in the dirt floor, toes curled as if preparing to push herself backward. She wasn't moving to attack. She was bracing for one. Richard held the lantern steady, letting her see him clearly. He didn't advance. He didn't lower his voice to soothe her. He simply stood there, waiting, trying to understand what he was looking at. Stress pinned tightly behind his ribs, but he forced himself to stay calm. Her breathing grew faster. When she finally spoke, her words broke unevenly. They said, "You are my husband now." She swallowed hard, as though the sentence itself pained her throat. Richard felt the weight of the situation immediately. Whoever lived here before had done something to her. She believed she belonged to him now, simply because he owned the cabin. A pressure settled in his chest that wasn't fear, but anger, directed not at her, but at the circumstance that trapped her here. "I bought this place yesterday," he said. "No one told me you were here." She stared at him, unable to decide whether his statement meant safety or danger. Richard recognized that look. He'd seen it on people who expected disappointment before it arrived. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled. He moved forward half a step out of instinct, but stopped instantly when she recoiled. He needed to earn her trust without force. He pulled off his coat and extended it from a distance, giving her time to decide. Her eyes flicked from the coat to his face, searching for trickery. When she reached for it, her hand shook so hard she nearly dropped it. "My name, Asha," she whispered. "Richard," he answered. Her expression remained guarded. She wasn't reassured yet. She didn't have a reason to be. "Let's get you out of here," he said. She hesitated, then followed him slowly, bracing herself on the stair rail. He kept his pace moderate, ensuring he never came close enough to crowd her. When she stepped into the main room, her body stiffened as she took in the cabin. The empty walls, the dark ceiling beams, the single lantern. Her eyes flicked between the door and the windows, checking escape routes. Richard crouched at the hearth and arranged the firewood. He struck a match, watching the flame crawl across the kindling. The room warmed gradually. Asha stood several steps away, still wrapped in his coat, watching every move he made with tense focus. He set a blanket on the floor near the fire. She hesitated, but eventually sat, pulling the blanket tight around her. Her fingers were cold and stiff. She held her hands near the fire without leaning too close, as if unsure whether warmth was something she could rely on. "Did the man who lived here before lock you down there?" Richard asked. She nodded once. "He leave. Time me first. Said someone come for me." Richard's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath before speaking again. "No one is coming for you now. Not like that." She studied him carefully, trying to decide whether to believe him. Her pulse still raced, but her breathing eased. His thoughts churned. He had intended to spend the winter repairing a forgotten property, working with his hands, staying away from other people. What he had found instead was a woman who had been left in a cellar like an object. She needed safety, food, warmth, a chance to understand her own options. His mission changed the moment he opened that cellar door, whether he liked it or not. Asha sat in silence, taking in the fire, the warmth, the room above ground. She didn't relax, not fully, but the rigid fear in her posture softened. Richard settled on the opposite side of the room, giving her space while still keeping her in sight in case she needed anything. He felt the weight of responsibility settling over him. Not forced, but unavoidable. Outside, the wind moved through the valley, quiet but constant. Inside, for the first time since he entered the cabin, Richard felt the gravity of someone else's survival resting beside his own. Asha did not thank him, and he did not expect her to. They simply shared the same room, each assessing what kind of person the other might be. A long, uncertain beginning had taken shape between them, and both understood that nothing about this night would be easily forgotten. The fire climbed higher as evening settled fully, filling the cabin with a steady glow that softened the rough edges of the worn interior. Asha sat wrapped in Richard's coat, legs pulled close, her fingers hovering above the light as if testing whether warmth was truly meant for her. Her breaths came slow but uneven, the earlier panic still working its way through her body. Richard set another log into the flames and adjusted it with the poker, careful not to move abruptly. He positioned himself at the small table across the room, giving her space while keeping her safely in sight. The table wobbled slightly when he set a tin cup down. He made a mental note to repair its legs in the morning. Asha watched him, tracking each motion with the focused attention of someone who had spent too much time preparing for danger. She did not speak, but her eyes revealed constant calculation. Richard reached for his saddlebag and took out a small packet of dried beans and a tin of salt. He poured the beans into a pot, added water, and set it on the grate above the fire. The scent rose slowly as it warmed. Asha stiffened at the sound of bubbling water, as though even harmless noises had become threats after so long underground. She finally asked, cautious and quiet, "You make food for me?" "For both of us," he answered. Her gaze lingered on the pot, trying to decipher the intention behind his offer. She had been denied the simplest kindnesses long enough that even a meal seemed suspicious. Without looking directly at her, Richard asked, "How long were you kept down there?" Asha took her time before replying. She looked toward the cellar door, her face tightening. "I not count days. Dark all time. He give food sometimes. Not much." She tightened the blanket around her shoulders. "I wait. He leave. No come back." Richard nodded once. He didn't push further. She had given him the truth she could manage for now. He measured her breathing, seeing that the memory unsettled her more than the words themselves. He stirred the pot gently, letting the sound of the spoon break the silence. Asha shifted closer to the fire and lowered her eyes to the floor. "Why you buy house if trouble here?" she asked carefully. "I didn't know," Richard said. "I wanted somewhere quiet, away from people, nothing else." She studied him again, trying to decide whether solitude made a man dangerous or safe. Her shoulders lowered slightly, though she stayed alert. Richard removed the pot from the grate and filled 2 bowls. He placed one on the floor near her without stepping into her space. She hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing the rim as though worried it might be snatched away. She tasted a small spoonful, chewing slowly, testing for anything unexpected. When nothing harmful followed, she ate another. "You cook better than old one," she said under her breath. Richard exhaled through his nose, something between a weary laugh and relief, but he didn't comment. He ate in silence, sitting cross-legged by the table. The lantern above him flickered, sending shadows across the walls. Asha watched how he held himself, calm, reserved, careful not to intrude on her side of the room. After finishing half the bowl, Asha set it aside and wrapped the coat tighter. "You don't want woman here?" The question carried no flirting, only fear of what men usually expected. Richard rested his bowl on the table. "I didn't come looking for anyone," he said plainly, "but I'm not turning you out." Asha absorbed this with visible tension in her jaw. She took in the cabin again, the repaired fire, the blanket beneath her, the open space that didn't feel like a trap. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted. "You don't need to decide tonight," Richard said. Her eyes moved to the window. The darkness outside seemed safer than the cellar had ever been, but she still watched it with uncertainty. "No men come for me?" she asked. "Not while I'm here," he answered. She weighed the sincerity of his tone, his steady voice, his controlled movements, and the way he kept his distance all began forming a picture in her mind that didn't match the man who had locked her away. Richard stood and took out a spare bedroll, laying it near the hearth but a good distance from her place. "You take this. Fire will keep you warm." She looked at the bedroll, then at him, making sure she understood. "You sleep there?" She pointed to the opposite corner. "Yes." Asha released a breath she had been holding. She touched the blanket beneath her as if grounding herself, then lowered her voice. "You strange man," she said, not unkindly, simply honest. "I've been called worse," he replied. For the first time since he found her, the tight line between her brows softened. Not a smile, just a small easing of fear. As the fire settled into a steady burn, Richard removed his boots and checked the pistol he kept near the table. He wasn't worried about Asha, but about whoever might come looking for what they believed they still owned. He glanced at the door, already planning a stronger lock for tomorrow. Asha watched him with a new kind of attention, not fear but curiosity. "You have family?" she asked softly. "No," he said, "not anymore." She didn't ask what happened. She sensed the boundary without being told. The room quieted. The fire cracked softly. Asha lay down on the bedroll, pulling the blanket up against her chin. Her eyes closed slowly, though she kept them half open for several minutes, checking the room again and again. Richard sat at the table until she finally slept. Her breathing changed, settling into a steady rhythm. Only then did he allow himself to rest on his own bedroll, facing the door, one hand near the pistol, not out of fear of her, but because he had seen enough cruelty in his life to know it rarely ended cleanly. Before sleep took him, he looked once more toward Asha. She slept curled inward, the coat wrapped around her small frame, no longer hidden beneath the floor, but still fighting the habits that captivity had built into her bones. Richard turned his gaze to the ceiling, aware that tomorrow would bring new decisions, repairs, and questions neither of them yet understood. It was the first night where the cabin held two people trying quietly to survive their own histories, sharing a fire that neither had planned for, but both needed more than they realized. Gray light seeped through the cracked window when Richard opened his eyes. The fire had burned down to a warm bed of coals, and the air inside the cabin carried a faint chill. He sat up slowly, joints stiff from sleeping on the uneven floorboards. Before doing anything else, he looked toward the hearth. Asha lay curled beneath the blanket, the coat still wrapped tightly around her. Her breathing was steady. She didn't look peaceful. Her hands were clenched near her chest, as if some part of her body braced out of habit. But she was asleep above ground, and that mattered. Richard stood quietly and moved to the door to check the weather. Frost coated the edges of the porch. The trees swayed gently, more from cold than wind. Cooper grazed near the hitch post, steam rising from his breath. The world felt still enough that Richard listened for anything unusual. Footsteps, distant hooves, men talking, but heard nothing. He returned inside and shut the door softly. Asha stirred at the sound. Her eyes snapped open, sharp and alert before she recognized where she was. Her shoulders lowered a little, but tension remained in her posture as she pushed herself upright. "You wake early," she said, voice rough from sleep. "Always have," he replied, pulling on his boots. She scanned the room again, confirming it hadn't changed overnight. "I thought maybe cellar again," she admitted quietly. "You won't go back there," he said firmly. The certainty in his tone made her pause. She studied him as if trying to understand why a man would make a promise without expecting something in return. Richard made a small gesture toward the water bucket. "You can wash up if you want. I'll go get more." Asha hesitated, then nodded. She waited for him to leave before standing fully. Her legs shook slightly when she rose, showing how long she had been kept in confinement. She held onto the table edge for balance. Outside, Richard hauled fresh water from the well. He filled the bucket, scanning the tree line for movement. The isolation was comforting, but the encounter in the cellar made him aware of the risks tied to the land's previous owner. He knew nothing about the kind of men the man dealt with, or whether they would come back looking for what he left behind. When Richard returned, Asha stood near the fire pit, smoothing her tangled hair with her fingers. She looked cleaner now, face and arms washed, though the cold air had turned her cheeks a soft red. She didn't look relaxed, but the sharp panic from the night before it faded. Richard set the bucket down and pulled out a skillet. "I'll make something simple," he said. Asha watched closely as he cracked eggs and stirred them over the heat. She stepped forward slowly, almost cautiously, and reached for a piece of old bread left on the shelf. She handed it to him without speaking, offering help in the only way she felt comfortable. He took it. "Thanks." While the eggs cooked, she moved around the room with quiet steps, taking in details she hadn't noticed the night before. A cracked mug on the shelf, a loose floorboard near the door, the revolver resting on the table within Richard's reach. She studied the gun longest, her expression difficult to read. "You use that often?" she asked. "Not unless I have to." She absorbed the answer carefully, trying to match it with the man standing in front of her. "Old man use gun too much," she said. "He shoot at ground, at walls, at me." Her voice hardened at the last word, but she didn't look away. Richard kept his tone even. "That won't happen here." Asha sat down near the table, pulling her feet beneath her, showing a little more trust by placing herself in a vulnerable position with him standing above her. Richard plated the food and slid a portion across the table. She accepted it, eating slowly but with more appetite than the night before. As they ate, she finally asked, "Why you live alone?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of water, thinking through what she deserved to know. "I worked too many places where fights broke out over small things," he said. Lost good people to bad decisions. Needed distance. Asha nodded, not pushing for more. Alone is safer sometimes, she said, her voice carrying a truth learned through painful experience. Richard looked at her wrists again, dark red and swollen. We'll get something on those today, he said. She lifted them slightly, surprised he noticed. If you have medicine, I'll make something with what I have. It won't sting. Asha seemed unsure how to respond to kindness. She folded her hands together and lowered her gaze. I'm not used to someone seeing hurt, she admitted. Richard stood and began clearing the table. I see it, he answered, but I'm not here to add to it. That stopped her. Her eyes widened with a fragile sort of disbelief, like hearing a language she'd forgotten. A soft knock sounded inside the cabin as the broom fell off the shelf unexpectedly. Asha jumped violently, heart pounding as she pressed back against the wall. Her reaction was immediate and intense, showing just how deeply fear lived inside her. Richard lifted the broom calmly and set it upright. It's just old wood shifting, he said. Nothing else. Asha exhaled shakily, embarrassed but unable to hide how her body reacted. I hear noise too long and dark, she said. Hard to stop. It'll ease, he said, not judging her panic. She sat again, pulling the coat around her. The firelight touched her face, and for the first time, her shoulders dropped a fraction in a sign of emerging trust. Richard looked toward the door, thinking of repairs that needed to be done before nightfall. I'll check the roof in a bit. You can rest if you need. She stood instead. I help, she insisted. I don't want to sit all day. Her determination impressed him. Despite wounds, fear, exhaustion, and starvation, she pushed herself upright with stubborn resolve. He nodded. Then we'll start with gathering wood. Asha stepped outside with him, blinking at the bright sky, maybe seeing open land for the first time in weeks. She took a breath that trembled but did not break. The day was beginning, and so was something else. Slow, cautious, unspoken. Two strangers learning how to share the same ground without stepping on each other's ghosts. The sun climbed just above the tree line as Richard and Asha stepped into the yard. Frost cracked softly beneath their boots, and faint steam rose from the horse's back where the early chill touched its coat. Asha wrapped the borrowed coat tighter around herself. Her bare feet, now covered with an old pair of Richard's socks she had folded and tied so they wouldn't slip off. They weren't proper shoes, but they kept her from freezing. Richard watched her for a moment, gauging how steady she seemed. She wasn't stable yet. Her legs still trembled when she shifted weight, but she held herself upright with stubborn determination. Don't push too hard, he said. I need to move, she replied, eyes fixed on the woodpile beside the cabin. Sitting makes thoughts worse. Richard understood that better than he expected. Work had been the only thing that kept him from getting pulled under after certain losses in his own life. He didn't question her further. He handed her a small hatchet. She accepted it, though her fingers hesitated around the handle. She was unsure, not of the tool, but of how he would react if she used it incorrectly. Richard stepped beside her, demonstrating with one clean strike how to split a thin piece of wood. You try, he said. Asha positioned the blade and brought it down with controlled force. The log cracked unevenly, but split. She stared at the result, as though surprised her body could still accomplish anything. Good, he said. She blinked, almost startled by the approval. They worked in a slow rhythm, Richard handling the larger logs, Asha breaking down the smaller ones. Each movement revealed more about her condition. Her arms were lean but tense, as if she'd been bracing for survival long before she was ever locked in that cellar. Her breathing hitched when she bent too low, showing soreness from confinement. Still, she continued. Birds scattered from a nearby pine at the sharp crack of Richard's axe. Asha jumped slightly, then steadied herself. She whispered something in Apache under her breath, likely a self-reminder to stay grounded. Richard didn't pry. Instead, he pointed to the corner of the cabin where the porch beam sagged. After wood, I'll lift that post. You can steady the boards if you feel up to it. She nodded, grateful to be included rather than dismissed. They continued until a faint rumble echoed from Asha's stomach. She froze, embarrassed. Richard didn't comment. He simply set the hatchet aside. "Let's take a break," he said. Inside the cabin, he prepared a simple meal of corn mush and dried meat softened in broth. Asha sat near the fire, rubbing her hands together to bring back warmth. When he served the food, she waited for him to sit before eating, a small habit that revealed more of her past than her words ever had. He pretended not to notice, giving her that small dignity. Between bites, she looked at him with cautious curiosity. "You live far from people a long time?" "Long enough," he answered. "You like quiet? It keeps me from trouble." She considered that. Some men bring trouble, even alone. Richard met her eyes, hearing the unspoken piece of that sentence. "I'm not interested in hurting anyone," he said. "Not you. Not anyone." Her shoulders lowered slightly, accepting the assurance. She finished the last spoonful and set the bowl aside. "I can mend things," she said. "So fix tears. Make hides into clothing. If you want." "I'd appreciate that," he replied. The offer meant more than she realized. It showed she wasn't just trying to survive, she was trying to contribute, to reclaim some agency after losing so much. When they returned outside, clouds had begun to gather over the ridge. Richard lifted the corner of the porch while Asha steadied the boards. She focused intently, not wanting to make mistakes. Richard watched her grip, noticing she preferred to brace with her left hand, likely because the right wrist hurt more from the rope. At one point, she lost her balance and steadied herself against his arm. Her fingers tightened reflexively, unsure whether to pull away. Richard didn't move. He simply waited until she chose to release him on her own. When she did, her face carried embarrassment rather than fear. "You're doing fine," he said. She nodded once, then resumed her task with new care. By midday, the wind shifted, bringing a colder draft through the valley. Richard glanced at the sky. "Storm coming," he said. "Probably light, but we should bring everything in." Asha gathered tools while he secured the horse feed. She moved quickly despite her fatigue, refusing to let him do all the work. When she carried the last bundle inside, she stopped near the door and looked out toward the tree-line. Her expression darkened. "What is it?" Richard asked. "This land feels strange," she said quietly. "Not bad, just quiet in different way." "Different how?" "Like place waiting." He didn't know what that meant, but he didn't dismiss it. People with her background noticed things others missed. Her instincts had likely kept her alive long before he ever found her. As the first flakes of snow drifted downward, Asha stepped back from the doorway and closed it firmly, as if sealing off whatever memories the outside stirred. She wrapped the coat around herself again and moved toward the fire. Richard shook the snow from his shoulders. "You did good work today." Asha lowered her gaze. "I tried." "You did more than try." Her lips parted slightly, not quite forming a smile, but softening in a way that indicated she heard him, even if she didn't know how to respond. As the snow picked up, tapping lightly against the window, Asha sat near the hearth and pulled her knees close, not from fear but from cold. Richard added more wood, the flames rising and filling the cabin with a deeper warmth. It was the first full day they had worked side by side, learning each other not through long conversations but through effort, caution, and shared labor. Neither said it aloud, but both understood it. Survival in the valley had become something they were no longer facing alone. The snowfall lasted only an hour, leaving behind a thin white layer across the yard that crunched underfoot. By afternoon, most of it had melted into patches, exposing the dark soil beneath. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily while Richard cleaned his rifle at the table. The last thing he needed was a weapon failing him in a remote valley, especially now that Asha lived under his roof. Asha sat on the floor near the hearth with a small piece of torn blanket spread across her lap. She threaded a needle with surprising steadiness, considering the raw marks on her wrists. She worked slow, not because the task was difficult, but because she hadn't used her hands freely in so long that the rhythm felt unfamiliar. Her eyes stayed focused, though her shoulders remained slightly tense, as if she expected someone to call out her name and pull the fabric away without warning. Richard watched her briefly, not wanting to intrude, but acknowledging the determination behind her movements. Her posture had changed in the past day, still guarded, but less tightly coiled. She no longer checked the cellar door every few minutes. She no longer scanned the corners of the room for traps. Healing wasn't linear, but she was inching toward it. "You so well," Richard said, setting the rifle aside. Asha kept her eyes on the thread. "I learned young," she replied. "My mother teach me before." She stopped, not ready to finish the sentence. Instead, she tied a knot, tightened it, and smoothed the fabric with her thumb. Richard didn't push her to continue. He had his own sentences that trailed off when old pain tried to resurface. After a few moments, Asha lifted her head. "I hear something earlier. Outside. When?" Richard asked. "Before you bring wood. Sound like step on dry branch." She turned slightly toward the window. "Not animal. Too slow." Richard's expression sharpened. He rose, walked to the window, and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved but the wind brushing through the pines. Still, her instincts had already proven sharper than most. "Could have been someone passing through," he said, though he doubted it. The land was too isolated for wanderers to appear twice in 2 days. "If you hear anything else, tell me right away." Asha nodded. Richard stepped outside to check the perimeter. The cold air hit his skin immediately, carrying the faint, metallic scent that often followed snowfall. He walked the property, studying the ground for tracks. Some deer prints cut across the edge of the yard, but nothing human. Yet he trusted Asha's alertness. She had survived captivity by noticing small changes others ignored. When he returned, Asha was standing beside the table, holding up the mended piece of cloth. "Better now," she said. "It looks good," he replied. Her eyes brightened slightly at the acknowledgement, though she hid the reaction quickly. Richard took out a small tin containing herbs, crushed pine, and animal fat. "For your wrists," he said. "This'll help them heal." Asha approached with visible caution, unsure how much pain to expect. Richard opened the tin and dipped 2 fingers lightly into the mixture, then waited for her permission. She extended her right hand, though her jaw tightened. The moment he touched the balm to her skin, she flinched, but not in fear this time. More from a sting of being tended to after so long. She watched his face closely, studying whether he would grow impatient or forceful. He didn't. His movements were slow, careful, steady. He worked with the quiet confidence of someone who had treated injuries before, on both people and livestock. "You learned this from Doctor?" she asked. "No," he said. "After a trail accident years ago. Had to figure things out myself." Her gaze softened slightly. Self-taught survival was something she understood. When he finished, she pulled her arms to her chest and looked down at the balm glistening on her skin. "Feels strange," she said. "Not bad. Just new." "You'll get used to it," he replied. Before either could say more, a sharp, distant crack echoed from the ridge. Not thunder, not an animal, with snapping under weight, or possibly a gunshot muffled by distance. Asha froze instantly. Her breath caught. Her hands clenched into fists against her chest. Richard moved to the window again, scanning the tree line with a heightened tension. The surrounding valley looked empty, but the sound had been real. He stepped outside once more, eyes sweeping the ridgeline. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Asha remained near the fire, her body stiff. When Richard returned, she spoke before he could. "I know that sound," she said. "Men break branch to tell others they close." Richard's pulse thudded once in his jaw. "Tracking signal?" She nodded. "They do that when looking for women who run. Or property taken." Her voice tightened on the last word. Richard shut the door firmly. "No one's taking you." Asha swallowed hard. "They might come. Let them try," he said, not raising his voice, but making the promise unmistakable. Asha's eyes glimmered with fear she tried to hide. She moved closer to the table, standing near him without realizing it, seeking proximity not for protection, but for reassurance. Richard thought through his options. The cabin was sturdy enough for a short defense, but better preparations were needed. Reinforced locks, secured shutters, a discreet lookout point. He had wanted a quiet winter, but fate rarely respected a man's plans. He turned to Asha. "Starting tomorrow, we fortify this place. I'll show you where to take cover if trouble comes." She breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. I can help. I know signs, sounds, tracks. We'll use that, he said. The crack from the ridge faded into silence, but its warnings settled heavily between them. The valley no longer felt empty. The cabin no longer felt merely old. It felt like a place that would soon be tested. Asha stepped closer to the fire, her hands trembling slightly. Richard added more wood, letting the flames rise high. Whatever shadows were moving in the ridge, neither of them would face them alone. By dawn, the air had sharpened enough to sting exposed skin. A thin veil of fog drifted across the yard, rolling low along the ground. Richard stepped outside first, scanning the ridge with attention he hadn't carried the day before. Asha followed a few steps behind, wrapped tightly in his coat, her hair hanging damp from the steam rising off the hearth inside. She didn't need to ask if he had slept. The fatigue around his eyes answered the question. He had spent most of the night listening for footsteps or unfamiliar voices. Nothing came, but that only made him more wary. Asha crouched near a cluster of pale snow by the porch. Richard watched as she pressed her palm against the frost and then leaned closer, studying the ground like a tracker trained from childhood. She traced a faint impression with her finger and tilted her head slightly. "What is it?" Richard asked. "Someone walk here," she said. "Last night, after snowfall." Her voice remained steady, but her body tightened with recognition. She pointed to the way the print angled toward the cabin before turning back into the trees. Richard knelt beside her. The track was light, someone moving carefully, heel barely touching the ground. Not a wandering stranger. Someone practiced. He came close, Asha whispered. "Not all the way. Watch first." Richard studied the surrounding ground. Whoever it was had circled wide, avoiding the open yard. They had approached quietly, reached the far edge of the woodpile, then turned back. "He didn't want to be seen," Richard said. Asha's jaw tightened. "They look for me. I know how they move." Richard followed the trail until it disappeared into the trees. The hunter's skill was clear. No broken branches. No heavy prints. Whoever searched had experience tracking people. Asha waited near the porch, arms crossed tightly as she scanned the distant ridge. Her breath rose in quick puffs. "If they come again," she said softly, "they not come alone." Richard walked back to her. "Then we prepare." She exhaled shakily. "I don't want to bring danger to your home." "You didn't," Richard replied. "It was already here the moment that man abandoned you." Asha looked at him with conflicted gratitude, unsure how to accept someone placing himself in harm's way without complaint. Richard motioned for her to follow as he walked to the barn. Inside, tools hung on nails. Old boards, a mallet, some bent nails sorted into a bucket. He looked everything over with the eye of someone planning a defensive line rather than a repair job. "We blocked the windows from inside," he said. "I'll reinforce the doors. If anyone tries to force their way in, they'll need time. That gives us the advantage." Asha stepped beside him, her expression shifting from fear to concentration. "I can hear footsteps before close," she said. "I know sound of brush moving when man. Try be quiet." "That'll help," Richard said. For the next hour, they worked in silence. Richard cut planks to fit the shutters while Asha hammered nails into place. She swung the hammer carefully, her arms trembling from weakness but guided by determination. Every hit echoed through the cabin walls, adding another layer of security. Richard reinforced the main door with an additional board. Asha stood near the window, watching him as he checked the hinges twice. She admired the way he moved, deliberate, efficient, every action shaped by a lifetime of relying on his own hands. "You used to danger," she observed. "I used to travel with men who made trouble," he said. "Learned fast how to survive it. Why you not stay with them?" "They weren't the kind worth staying with," he answered simply. Asha nodded. She understood, walking away from people who treated survival like a game. By midday, the cabin had grown noticeably darker, the new boards blocking sunlight. Asha lit an extra lantern and set on the table. Richard saw her glance toward the cellar door, not in fear, but in calculation, assessing whether it could serve as a hiding place or escape route if men returned. "There's another way out," Richard said, gesturing toward the small back window. if needed. Asha appreciated the directness. Men in her past had hidden truths or used fear to keep her compliant. Richard did neither. As they worked, the wind carried a faint sound down the valley, a distant whistle, sharp and short. Asha froze instantly. "That signal," she whispered. "That means group found trail." Richard gripped the edge of the table, jaw flexing. "They're closer than we thought." Asha's hands trembled, but her eyes were sharp. "If they want to take me, they come today or tomorrow. Not while I'm here," Richard said, voice calm but unyielding. She stepped closer to him without realizing it, drawn by the steadiness he carried. "Why you stand with me?" she asked quietly. "You know nothing of me." "Because leaving you to them isn't something I could live with," he said. The sincerity behind the statement caught her off guard. She looked down, swallowing hard. No one had chosen to protect her in years. A sudden clang interrupted the moment, the sound of metal striking wood outside. Richard and Asha exchanged a quick glance. He signaled for her to stay low while he moved to the narrow gap in the shutter. Asha crouched behind the table, heart pounding, instinct sharpening every breath. Richard peered out. A metal hook hung from the fence post, freshly placed, the kind used by hunters to mark a location. Someone had left it during the night. Asha's voice trembled as she whispered, "They mark house. They come back with more." Richard stepped away from the window, the weight of the situation settling fully across his shoulders. "Then we stay ready." Asha steadied herself on the table. Fear still lived inside her, but something else rose beside it, trust. Not complete, not confident, but unmistakably forming. Richard checked the rifle's chamber, then looked at her. If they show themselves again, they'll learn this place isn't what the old owner left behind. Asha held his gaze. "I won't run," she said. He nodded. "You won't have to." Evening approached slowly. Heavy with tension, neither of them tried to hide. Outside, the valley remained quiet, but now the silence felt like a held breath, waiting to break. The next morning arrived with a hard, colorless sky. Frost clung to every surface, turning the yard into a brittle sheet that cracked under the slightest pressure. Richard stepped outside before the sun fully crested the ridge, scanning the valley with attention that belonged to men who had already survived too much. He checked the fence, the woodpile, the tree line, every shadow, every track. Asha remained inside the doorway, watching him with unease. She didn't step onto the porch until he gave a brief nod, signaling it was safe for the moment. As she joined him, her gaze snapped upward. 3 silhouettes stood on the ridge. Tall figures, motionless, positioned side by side like markers. They weren't close enough to threaten, yet not far enough to ignore. They stood with the confidence of men who believed they had every right to survey the land below. Asha's breath shortened instantly. Her hands curled into the sleeves of Richard's coat, gripping the fabric as if bracing for impact. Richard's jaw tightened. "Stay behind me." "They found my trail," she whispered. "They wait to see if I run or hide." "They're not getting near this cabin," he said, voice steady but low. The figures didn't move for several minutes. Then one lifted his arm and pointed directly toward the cabin. Not a greeting, a warning. Asha backed up until she reached the porch railing. Her legs trembled, but her eyes stayed locked on the ridge. "I know that man in middle," she said. "He helped old owner catch women. He hurt many." Her voice cracked on the last word. Richard glanced at her. "You seen him before he took you?" "No," she said. "He come later. He check if I still alive." She swallowed, struggling to keep her voice level. "He not care if I die. He care if someone else want me." Rage flickered through Richard, not explosive but cold and controlled. He wasn't a man who shouted or cursed, but the tightening around his eyes revealed enough. The men on the ridge finally turned and walked out of sight, disappearing behind tall pines. Asha exhaled as if she had been waiting for permission to breathe. "They not leave far," she said. "They watch." Richard guided her inside, closing the door firmly and lowering the wooden beam he'd installed the day before. She sat by the hearth, not shivering from cold, but from memory. He knelt to stoke the fire, giving her a moment to gather herself. After a few minutes, she spoke quietly. "They think you like old owner. They think you keep me until they come. They can think what they want, Richard said. They're wrong. Her eyes softened in a way he hadn't seen before. Fear mixed with something approaching relief. He stood and retrieved a small map from the table drawer. He unfolded it across the wood surface. I need to know where they might set camp, he said. You know how they travel? Asha joined him at the table, her movements cautious but determined. She pointed at a bend in the ridge. There, hidden place. They tie horses in shade and sleep under rocks. Hard to see from valley. Richard tapped the map thoughtfully. That gives him a clear view of the cabin. Yes, she said. They wait for night or for you to leave. I'm not leaving you alone, he replied. Asha lowered her gaze. Why you do this? You owe me nothing. Richard leaned against the table. I'm not letting men like that take anyone from this place. Not again. His emphasis on the last words made Asha look up sharply, realizing he carried scars of his own making. He rarely spoke about himself, but the brief flash of pain behind his eyes hinted at a memory he refused to revisit out loud. Asha stepped closer. She didn't touch him. She was not ready, and he wouldn't have asked it, but she came close enough that he felt a shift in her trust. A sudden thump struck the side of the cabin. Both of them stiffened. Richard grabbed the rifle, signaling Asha to stay low. She crouched behind the table, heart pounding against the wood. He approached the wall, silently, and peeked through a narrow gap in the shutter. A stone lay in the snow, near the cabin, freshly thrown. Wrapped around, it was a strip of cloth. Richard retrieved it and unrolled the fabric. Dark stains marked the inside, blood dried but recent. Asha's breath hitched. They send message, she said. They say they take back what old owner paid for. Richard's grip on the rifle tightened. They don't decide that. The rest of the day passed under thick tension. Richard prepared the cabin as if expecting a siege, checking ammunition, reinforcing boards, clearing lines of sight. Asha helped by organizing supplies, securing food, and checking every window for weaknesses. She moved quietly, never wasting steps, her instincts honed from years of forced vigilance. As evening approached, they sat near the fire, both alert despite the exhaustion settling into their muscles. They come after dark, Asha said softly. Always do. Richard shook his head. They're testing the place first, watching how we react. They won't rush unless they think we're afraid. I'm afraid, she admitted. Her voice didn't shake. It was simply the truth. Being afraid doesn't make you weak, Richard said. It makes you careful. Asha studied his face, searching for the moment he might show doubt. But he didn't. His calm was steady, not forced. You not leave me, she said, more statement than question. Not now, he answered. Not ever. A shadow of a smile flickered across her lips, brief, fragile, but real. The wind shifted outside. Snowflakes began tapping lightly against the shutters. Night was settling fast. Both of them knew the valley would not remain quiet much longer. And for the first time since Asha emerged from the cellar, she no longer felt alone in facing what waited beyond the treeline. Night settled with a thickness that swallowed the edges of the valley. The moon remained hidden behind shifting clouds, leaving only the faint glow of starlight on the snow. Richard kept the lanterns low inside the cabin, allowing just enough illumination to see Asha's movements, but not enough to reveal their exact positions to anyone watching from outside. Asha sat near the hearth, legs folded beneath the blanket, her eyes tracking every sound. The fear running through her wasn't wild or panicked. It was focused, sharpened by years of enduring danger. Her breaths stayed controlled, but her hands trembled slightly each time the wind brushed against the shutters. Richard paced the length of the room, rifle in hand, stopping occasionally to listen. Every creak in the walls made him halt. Every shift in the roof beams made him check his weapon. The silence outside carried weight, as if the valley held its breath for the violence it sensed coming. You hear anything? Asha asked quietly. Nothing yet, he said. That's the part that bothers me. She nodded, understanding immediately. Men who hunted people rarely charged without watching first. They preferred the advantage of timing over brute force. A faint crack echoed from beyond the treeline. Asha stiffened. Richard lowered himself beside the window, keeping his head below the shutter line. He peered through the thin gap he'd left earlier. Nothing moved in the yard. The sound had come from farther back, too distant to see anything clearly. Another noise followed, a soft, deliberate whistle carried by the wind. Asha gripped the blanket tightly. "They spread out," she whispered. "They wait for signal." Richard's instincts aligned with her assessment. "They're positioning," he said, "trying to box us in." Asha swallowed hard. "If they come from cellar side, we hear late." "I reinforced that wall," Richard said. "They'll need time to break through." She blinked slowly, torn between relief and dread. "They try when you least expect." "Well," Richard said, "I expect them now." He moved to the center of the room and checked the rifle chamber again. Asha watched the way he handled it. No hesitation, no wasted motion. She had seen men with weapons many times before. Most used them with arrogance or cruelty. Richard carried his with responsibility, not pride, and that difference eased her breathing. He set an extra knife on the table. "If anyone gets close, you use this. Don't freeze." Asha looked at the blade as though it were a piece of her old life resurfacing. She reached for it, held it firmly, and nodded. "I know how." Richard didn't doubt her. In the next moment, a heavy thump struck the back wall of the cabin. Asha jumped to her feet. Richard motioned for her to stay behind the table. He moved silently toward the sound, pressing his shoulder against the inner boards. Another blow landed, this one stronger. Someone was testing the reinforcement. A muffled voice carried through the wood. It was low, mocking, familiar in the way men spoke when they believed they owned everything they touched. Asha's breath caught. "That's him," she whispered. "Middleman on Ridge. His name, I not say." "You don't have to," Richard said. The voice called out again, words slurred from arrogance rather than drink. "We know she's in there. You got something that don't belong to you." Richard didn't reply. He held his position, thinking through the angles. There were at least 3 men, likely more. They wouldn't shoot yet. They wanted her alive. Another thump, then another. Asha flinched each time, though she didn't retreat from her place. She held the knife in both hands, her stance solid. Richard returned to the table and signaled for her to stay quiet. He grabbed his rifle and took position near the front window. A faint flicker of movement appeared between the trees, a silhouette shifting from trunk to trunk. "They're probing every side," he murmured. "Try to find the weakest point." Asha stepped close enough that her shoulder almost touched his arm. She whispered, "They not expect you to fight. They think you sell me back or give me to them." "They don't know me," he said. Outside, snow crunched under boots, multiple steps converging at different angles. A whispered command traveled through the dark. The men were coordinating. Asha's pulse hammered in her throat. She had been trapped before, but never with someone willing to stand for her. That truth unsettled her more than the threat outside. Richard moved away from the window, pulled Asha gently behind the table, and crouched beside her. His hand never grazed her skin. He kept a respectful distance, even in urgency. "I need you to stay down," he said quietly. "If they try to break in, they'll aim high first. That gives us time." Asha nodded, though her legs trembled. A sudden crash shook the back of the cabin. Wood splintered. Someone struck the reinforced beam with a heavy tool. Richard braced the rifle against his shoulder. They found the weak section. Asha felt her chest tighten. "What do we do?" "We make them rethink coming any closer." He moved to the back wall and waited for the next blow. When it came, a harder hit that cracked the first layer of wood. Richard fired a single shot upward through the top corner of the wall where he knew no one inside could be harmed. The bullet tore through the timber and exploded into the night air. Outside, a man cursed loudly. Boots scattered. Asha's breath shook, but she steadied herself. "You scare them. Not enough to stop them," Richard said, "but enough to slow them down." For a long moment, the valley fell silent, except for the wind pushing thin branches against the roof. Then, something unexpected. Another sound traveled through the cold air. Hoofbeats. Not many, just one horse, approaching fast from the north. Asha's eyes widened. One of them. Richard shook his head. No, they'd never ride in alone. Whoever it was, the rider closed the distance quickly. The attackers stepped back into the trees, uncertain whether this new arrival was friend or enemy. Richard positioned himself by the door, rifle ready. A sharp voice rang out near the porch. "Boone, that you in there?" Asha stiffened. "You know this man?" Richard's eyes narrowed with disbelief. "I haven't heard that voice in 5 years." The hoofbeats slowed, and the horse snorted, its breath steaming. The same voice shouted, "Open up before I freeze to death." Asha gripped the knife tighter, unsure whether this newcomer meant salvation or more danger. Richard lowered the rifle slightly, not relaxed, but no longer aiming at the door. "If it's who I think it is," he said quietly. Everything just got complicated. Outside, the unseen rider waited in the dark, unaware of the enemies hidden in the tree lean, or the frightened woman crouched behind the table, only calling out again, "Boone, it's me. Don't make me break your damn door." Richard hesitated only a moment before unbarring the door. Asha crouched low behind the table, gripping the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. The danger outside hadn't disappeared. Those men still lingered in the dark, but the rider calling Richard's name hadn't sounded like an enemy. He sounded like someone who believed he still had a place in Richard's life. When Richard pulled the door open, a tall man stepped inside quickly, shutting it behind him before the cold flooded too deeply into the cabin. Snow clung to his coat, hat, boots, everything. He carried a heavy saddlebag and a rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was lined, stern, but softened when he saw Richard. "Well, damn," the man muttered, lowering his scarf. "Didn't think you were still breathing out here." Richard didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased. "Caleb," he said quietly, acknowledging the man. Asha watched from behind the table, eyes narrowed, trying to read whether this newcomer brought safety or a new kind of threat. Caleb took one step forward before freezing. His gaze flicked toward the movement near the table. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply straightened, alert. "You taking a guess now?" he asked. Richard moved slightly to the side, so Caleb could see Asha clearly. But he positioned himself between them, a silent message that she was not to be approached without consent. "She's under my protection," Richard said. Caleb's eyes lingered on Asha's torn sleeves, the bruising on her wrists, the defensive posture she still held. Understanding dawned quickly. He lowered his hands slowly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said to her directly. "Just passing through. Didn't know trouble followed me over the ridge." Asha didn't speak, but her breathing steadied as she studied him. He was not like the men outside. No predatory stare, no cruel edge in his tone. Richard locked the door again. "You saw the tracks?" "3 men working the ridge," Caleb said. "Didn't know they were after you until I saw them circling your place. Been keeping distance, watching their movements before I came closer." Asha's voice finally emerged. "They want to take me." Caleb nodded once, grim. "Figured it was something like that." Richard crossed the room to adjust the window boards. "They tried breaking in earlier. Won't stop long." Caleb unslung his rifle and checked the chamber. "Then let's make sure they don't get another chance." Asha blinked, surprised that a stranger would stand with them so easily. She glanced at Richard, searching his expression. He gave a small nod. Caleb could be trusted. Caleb glanced around the cabin. "Your place is holding, but they're getting bold. We need to end this before they gather more men." Asha stepped closer, still cautious. "You go out? They shoot." Caleb shook his head. "Not tonight." Richard understood immediately. "Morning gives us advantage." Caleb pointed toward the ridge. "They'll stay close until sunrise. They expect you too scared inside. They won't expect us to come to them first." Asha stiffened. "You leave cabin?" Richard looked at her carefully. "This ends with them gone. We can't wait for them to make the next move." Her throat tightened. "You get hurt if you go." "I'm not planning to," he said with quiet certainty. Asha stepped forward, tension racing through her body. "If they take you, I alone again." Richard didn't touch her, but he didn't look away either. "They won't lay a hand on me." Caleb cleared his throat. "When the sun rises, we move. Until then, we rest and stay quiet." Asha moved back to the fire, sitting close enough that Richard could see the fear tightening her posture. He sat across from her, not too near, not too far. Caleb settled at the table, sorting extra ammunition, checking his sights, working with steady, efficient movements. Hours passed in tense silence. When the first pale light appeared along the ridge, Richard stood and pulled on his coat. Asha rose instantly. "I come too," she said, voice trembling but steady. "No," Richard answered gently. "I need you safe here." Asha shook her head, eyes burning with conviction. "I not hide while you fight for me." Richard stepped closer, not to dominate, but to speak to her clearly, honestly. "This isn't about you hiding. It's about choosing the place where you can survive. Let me and Caleb finish this." Her breath wavered, but she didn't argue again. Instead, she picked up the knife, held it to her chest, and said, "I wait. But come back." Richard nodded once. "I will." Caleb pushed open the door. The cold morning air swept in, and the two men slipped out quietly, leaving Asha inside with the fire and her pounding heartbeat. The valley was washed in gray light. The snow had crusted overnight, carrying sound farther than usual. Richard and Caleb moved low along the tree line, avoiding exposed ground. They found the tracks easily, deep impressions heading toward a rocky outcrop where the attackers had sheltered. Richard raised his hand. 3 figures stood near a small fire, unaware of the approach. They argued bitterly about payment, about time wasted, about whether to storm the cabin once daylight strengthened. Caleb leaned close. "We call them out first. Let them see they're not the only ones with rifles." Richard stepped out from behind the rocks, rifle raised but not firing. "This ends now," he said, voice carrying across the clearing. The men spun around, startled. "You got something of ours," the leader snarled. Richard didn't blink. "She belongs to no one. Not now. Not ever." One of the men reached for his gun. Caleb fired a warning shot that slammed into the ground near his boot, scattering snow and forcing him backward. "Drop it," Caleb barked. They hesitated, surprised by the precision, the confidence. The leader spat in the snow. "She's worth money. We ain't leaving without her." Richard stepped forward, gaze deadly calm. "You take one step toward that cabin, and none of you make it off this ridge." The men looked at each other, weighing their odds. A second warning shot from Caleb's rifle cracked the tension in half. 2 of them dropped their weapons. The leader hesitated a long moment, then finally released his. Caleb kicked their guns away. "You head north," he said, "and if we see you circle back, there won't be words next time." The men backed away, cursing, shouting empty threats, but retreating all the same, slipping between the trees until their voices faded into the distance. Richard watched until the last figure vanished. Only then did he lower his rifle. Caleb exhaled. "2 stubborn fools just saved a woman neither of us knew last week." Richard gave a faint, tired smile. "Feels like the right thing." They walked back toward the cabin. As soon as Richard stepped through the door, Asha ran to him. Not recklessly, not blindly, but with controlled relief that nearly broke her composure. She didn't throw herself into his arms, but she stood close, close enough that her trembling eased only when he nodded to her. "It's done," he said. Her eyes softened, filling with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, steadier. "You come back," she whispered. "I said I would." Caleb set his rifle down. "You 2 need space. I'll head for town once I warm up. You'll be all right now." Richard looked at Asha. "We will." Asha stepped closer, gathering her courage. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I want to stay. With you. Not because forced."
Because safe. Richard held her gaze, seeing not the frightened woman from the cellar, but someone building a future from the pieces she had left. "Then stay," he said, "as long as you want." Asha released a breath that shook her entire frame. Then, for the first time, she touched his hand. Light, deliberate, steady. The cabin was no longer a place of captivity. It was home, for both of them,